December 12th. Stick your store. That night was the first night, and the first time I'd ever even seen one of them. My brother and I were out in the sheep shed, warm amongst the flock. Sheep are pretty important out here, and at the farm, they make up most of our livelihood. We got cows, 2 of them at least, and we were making strides with what Ulf called hothouse growing, but the sheepfold was still their biggest priority. Iceland really doesn't have any predators, but sheep are not what you'd call the smartest creatures. My presence here was to make sure that one of them didn't wander off into the middle of the night and freeze to death out in the cold. Sheep seem to be continuously looking for a way to accomplish this. A hole in the wall or a separation between the dirt floor and the wall to scoot under. That's why they need to be watched. We had arrived just before sunset and found Goff standing out smoking a cigarette. He hailed us and I introduced him to Davin. Davin was bundled up in his new scarf, mittens, thermal cap, and his heavy jacket that made him look a little like a turtle as he peeked through the gap. Goff asked him how he was liking Iceland, and Davin told him it was great. I was glad to hear him say it, but then Goff confided in me that we were here for more than to watch the flock tonight. It's Gertrude. Her time is close. You need to make sure she delivers okay. I nodded and told him that it shouldn't be a problem. This was far from my first time whelping lambs. Gertrude was a ewe with many seasons behind her, who had added many lambs to the herd in her time. She was getting ready to pop any day now, and Arnar wanted her to be watched, so we could get the lambs dry and sheltered if they decided to have them out in the field. The lambs would be weak when they were born, and the wind could kill a man without proper clothes, much less a little lamb. I was sitting next to her now, Davin petting her as he tried to stay awake. The trusting old thing had her head on my knee, and as the mounds of cotton clouds slumbered around us, she seemed to be the only one that was still awake. It was nearly 2 in the morning, the wind howling outside like an angry cat, and I smiled at Davin when I looked over to see him snoozing. He was curled up underneath his new coat, the blanket he was sitting on keeping the worst of the floor off his pants, and he was leaning against one of the woolly rams which was leaning against him in return. The two seemed to be companionable, and I shook my head as my own eyes got heavy. I shook awake pretty quick when I heard the sound of metal being pushed up, but I assumed it was the wind at the time. Damn wind! Gotta find that hole before the sheep do, I muttered, getting to my feet. I shifted Gert, the old ewe making a soft sound of complaint as I laid her head on the ground, and started making my way through the sleeping sheep to find the hole. I didn't have to look far. A chorus of upset bleating led me to the opening in the wall, and I saw that the wind had pushed it up a bit. The howling menace was still shoving at the end as I pulled it back into place, pushing it back into place as I heaped some dirt on it to keep it down. The sheep quieted then, more concerned with the cold air getting in than anything else, and settled in so they could get back to sleep. I noticed, though, that there was something strange about the hole when I got in close. The metal siding wasn't separated at a corner like I had thought. The metal had a jagged cut in it, like someone had used a knife or something to cut into the side of the sheep shed. I thought about sheep thieves first, but why would they make such a small hole if they meant to steal sheep? The hole that had been cut was barely large enough for a child, and the weather was far too brutal for any children to be out in it. I swept my light around the shed. I didn't expect to find anything, but I still needed to look. The sheep were snuggled together, shuddering a little as my light danced over their closed eyes, and it was a little like looking through a cloud bank. They had to be 150 sheep in the shed, and they were packed together so tightly that I had no clue what I was expecting to find. That was, until my light fell on a hat in the midst of them. It was a tall red hat, like what a gnome might wear in a children's story. It was patched and dirty, and despite it being just a hat, it almost felt like it was looking at me. I felt my flashlight shake a little as I held it on that pointy hat, wondering if it was on a sheep or just what the hell it was sticking on. It was probably a trick. Ulf liked to play pranks, and I would make my way over there to find a ratty old hat stuffed onto an orange cone or something. I wanted to walk right over to it and prove that it was nothing special. I wanted to part the sheep and feel silly when I discovered that it was just Ulf making mischief. But I couldn't move. I had instructed my feet to move, but they remained where they were. The sheep slept peacefully around me, and it seemed like the world belonged to me in this strange red hat. The light beam hung there, bringing me to this oddity, and I somehow didn't like that any better. I wanted to turn the light off, breaking that bond between us, but I knew I didn't dare. That would leave me alone in the dark with the wearer of that hat. When the hat moved, I took a shaky step backward. My bum hit the metal wall, and I was aware suddenly that I was trapped by the walls and the sleeping sheepfold all around me. I looked back and found that the hat was moving towards me. It came on easily amongst the sheep, a hollow thumping noise following with it. As it came closer and closer to me, I looked for an escape, but I was blocked in on all sides. Thump, thump, thump. It was moving methodically towards me, the distance barely 20 feet as it cut through the soft clouds. Thump, thump, thump. I lunged to the left, but the sheep before me only bleated and turned away as I bumped him. Thump, thump, thump. She was a big, solid ewe, fat and ready for slaughter, but right now, she might as well have been a boulder as I tried to shove between her and another sheep. Thump, thump, thump. The hat bobbed about as it came closer, the owner of it sounding like he was on crutches or had a fake leg or something. Thump, thump, thump. Why would something so small have a fake leg? Thump, thump, thump. What could it possibly want with me? Thump, thump, thump. I put my hands up in fear, casting the light over my face as it came within a foot of me, and readied my foot for a kick if it came any closer. That's when I heard the loud bleating of a sheep in distress. It was from the direction I had come, back towards old Gertrude and my brother, and the hat wearer stopped at the sound. We both stood inches apart, me too scared to point the light down and see what was standing there, and the creature too intrigued by the noise. When I heard my brother yelling my name from the direction of the commotion, I stiffened, afraid the hat might start heading in his direction. He said the sheep was having babies, and I needed to help him because he didn't know what he was doing. I turned back towards the thing, but the flashlight beam showed me that the hat was gone. I started jostling my way through the sheep as I made my way back to my brother's side. As I came upon them, he was sitting with Gertrude, his new coat used to warm the 3 squishy-looking lambs. They were bleeding and shivering, and I grabbed for the stack of towels we kept not far off. Gertrude was still pushing them out, her own bleeding loud and pained, and as a fourth fell to the cold dirt, Davin and I started drying them off, rubbing the warmth into their wet little bodies, as Gertrude licked at the fourth one, trying to warm him up. 4 was uncommon for a lambing, but Gertrude was a pro. She sat amongst her new lambs after we'd warmed them up and licked them as she shared her warmth. I looked down at the little guy I was cleaning and sucked in a breath as I laid him with the others. The lamb had eyes like milk, and one of his legs was bent oddly. Gert cleaned him, the poor little creature baaing pathetically, but she pushed him away when he tried to suckle. The other 3 drank greedily as the fourth wandered away, towards the other sleeping sheep looking for suck. That was odd for Gertrude. Usually she was very motherly, and I couldn't miss the sad look on her face as she watched the little lamb wobble away. My brother had gone back to sleep, his head pressed against the slimy jacket, and I reached out for the blind lamb as I sat back to watch Gertrude feed them. She bleated at me, seeming to tell me to let it be, but I picked it up and drew it close anyway. Arnor would decide what to do with it in the morning, and if it died, it wouldn't be any fault of mine. Gertrude lay back, seeming to look at me disapprovingly, as she settled back to sleep while the sheep suckled. I yawned and patted the blind lamb, feeling it shiver as it tried to nurse against my jacket, and with each stroke of its soft skin, I felt myself getting sleepier and sleepier. I woke up face to face with a nightmare. The thing had its squashed nose about an inch from my face, the familiar red hat sagging a little atop its lumpy head. Its scabby beard was damp, and I realized with horror that it had been drinking milk. I looked at Gertrude, but the 3 lambs were still there, and her eyes were sad and on me. The thing was still looking at me, grumbling in a huffy little voice as its eyes bored into mine. He could only be one thing, but he looked very different from the posters and books I'd seen of them. They always made them look like little Father Christmases, with their red coats and white beards and jolly demeanor, mischievous in their own way as they went about the holiday. They had reminded me of the dwarves from Snow White when I'd seen them, and I laughed at the thought of these little creatures sneaking about my house and leaving gifts. This thing looked nothing like a dwarf or a Father Christmas. Its skin was the color of oatmeal. It was lumpy and covered with a screed of mangy hair, its coat looking more muddy than red. It had a long knife in its belt, and its horny foot looked black and bloated, save for the wooden one. This one had to be Strekjastor, called Stumpy in English, the first to come, and he was always kind of funny looking when they drew him. He had a wooden leg, sometimes 2, and he stumped about as he tried to steal sheep's milk from the teat. He didn't seem funny at all now. As he left, I noticed that he had the blind lamb in his hands, and I heard the sheep mutter unhappily as he moved between them. Before I could find my nerve, he was gone. That's where Arnar found me a few hours later, still frozen by fear and staring out into the mass of sheep. He looked at Davin before he asked, "You see him?" I nodded, not bothering to pretend I didn't know what he was talking about. He only nodded. "Ugly bastard, ain't he?" "You've seen him too?" I asked, flabbergasted. Arnar nodded, looking at Gertrude as she and her lambs slept. "Had a late batch of lambs once myself, when I was no older than your brother there. Da sent me to sit with them that night. That was the night that Gertrude was born, she and her 4 brothers. She was small, a shivering thing, and her mother would not suckle her. I tried to make her, but she just looked at me sadly and pushed old Gert away. That night, he came for her. I saw his little hat first, making its way through the sheep, but my Da had told me what he really was, and I was little more prepared than you. I picked up a pitchfork and held my ground. I wouldn't let that little puddin'-head bastard near my Gert. He eventually took one of the others and left. Gert's mother let her suckle after that, and Gertrude grew up to be the best sheep in the flock." He bent and stroked the old ewe, and she leaned her head up to reciprocate. "Was it lame?" he asked. I nodded, and blind. "And male?" he asked, eliciting a second nod. "Then he's done us a favor. Only the strong survive up here, as well you know." He came back a few hours later with breakfast and a new coat for Davin. I told him I'd pay him for it, but he brushed it off. Arnar said he had done a fine job of birthing 3 strong sheep, and that he ought to have something for it. Davin looked confused. I thought there were 4. I shook my head. "He died in the night, kiddo. Guess he wasn't cut out for it." We fixed the hole in the shed later that day. I wish that was my last encounter with the Yule lads, but since he was only the first, you know that isn't so. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. I hope you've enjoyed night 2 of our Yule lad stories. Tonight we got to meet the first of the lads, Strekjastor. Sorry if I butchered that, my Icelandic isn't very good. Called Stumpy in English, he has a peg leg, sometimes 2. Sometimes he has wooden hands, too. It just depends which legend that you read. He's also known as Sheepcoat Clod, and he tries to suckle ewes in the farmer's sheep shed. I figured I'd take an opportunity at the end to maybe explain a little bit about the Yule lads and their legacy. I stumbled upon them last year while I was looking up the Yule Cat for a Yuletide story that I've already put on the channel, and I just knew that I had to make a little series out of them. They're so very interesting for being, holiday boogaboos, that I knew I had to do something with them, and I think it's turned out quite well. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the two brothers and the Yule lads, and I hope you'll settle in for many more nights to come. If you're feeling like you might like some more spooky Christmas stories, why not head on down to my holiday playlist? I have quite a few holiday spooky stories down there. I think they'll be great for trimming the tree or just eliciting some chills up your spine in this festive time of year. Since we're talking about Icelandic folklore, I'd recommend reading last year's story about the Yule cat. It's up there if you'd like to have a look. I've been told it's pretty good. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the show in a more monetary way, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. You can also get your spooky a little bit early in the morning time, as opposed to in the evenings when I usually put them out. And join the little community I'm growing down on Patreon. So, if you'd like to have a look, come on down. If you'd like a copy of my new book, which is Fall Frights and Winter Chills, then feel free to click the link below and see if you can find something else for everyone on your spooky Christmas list this year. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.